the popping sounds of automatic gunfire. The coup in the Kremlin is almost 2 days old, and the confrontation between soldiers and pro-democracy demonstrations has now begun. Outside the building of the Russian parliament, armored vehicles working to break through the barricades that have been erected around the building. People are hurt. Some have been killed. Reports indicate at least 2 people have died while confronting these tanks. At one point, opponents of the coup trap a military vehicle beneath an underpass and attack it with Molotov cocktails. Witnesses say soldiers inside then opened fire. Russian President Boris Yeltsin is leading the resistance from inside the Russian parliament building. On Tuesday, he emerged to rally his supporters.
Clouds of terror and dictatorship are gathering over Russia, but this night will not be eternal, and our long-suffering people will find its freedom once again for good. Soldiers, I believe, at this tragic hour, you will take the right decision. The honor of Russian arms will not be covered with the blood of the people.
Meanwhile, 3 leaders of this coup reportedly have stepped down. Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, and the head of the KGB, Vladimir Khrushchev. Speculation within the United States intelligence community, the coup may be unraveling. And still, no sign of this man, ousted President Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. Moscow's former deputy mayor says he's learned that Mr. Gorbachev was arrested Monday in the Crimea as he tried to board a plane and return to Moscow. Well, it's now a few minutes past 5 in the morning in Moscow. Our Moscow bureau chief, Steve Hurst, has been keeping a close eye on developments outside the Russian parliament building. He joins us now live with the latest. Steve?
Bernie, dawn is about to break, a light rain falling, the streetlights have now gone off, and we're seeing the barricade at the end of the bridge leading over the Moscow River towards the Russian Federation building being shorn up. More buses have been towed in, placed in front of those trolley buses that we had seen for the past day and a half. Also, the people down there are growing in numbers again as dawn breaks. They at one point formed a human chain. The city is rife with rumors this time that there may be a tank division headed into town down Kutuzovsky Prospect here to rescue Boris Yeltsin, but of course that's probably wishful thinking. Earlier tonight, beginning about midnight Moscow time, Soviet APCs, armored personnel carriers, began going to work, as we saw earlier, trying to break apart trolleybus barricades. These scenes taken in front of the American embassy, which is about a half-mile from the Russian Federation Parliament. Some very graphic pictures, people trying to hold on to these giant machines, trying to stop them with their hands with bars in the treads, at some point setting them on fire.
Steve, I have 2 questions. One, how effective, as daylight comes there in Moscow, how effective has this curfew been?
Well, the curfew has been completely ineffective, and the big problem that the military has in trying to enforce it, as you can see from the pictures, is that virtually every major street in Moscow is blocked solid with trolleybuses. And even if they were inclined to try to enforce the curfew on the first night, there was no way to move around and capture these people. And I'm not sure that they were inclined, Bernie. I think that the situation is so volatile, if there was a sweep picking up people, especially those surrounding the Russian parliament, that they would only compound the problems that they already face. The big question to me is, why did the leaders of this coup wait so long to try to break apart these barricades? Why didn't they try to stop it before it started? Right now they have a horrible problem on their hands, but they've had enough tanks inside the city for more than 24 hours now to prevent just this kind of thing from happening. There seems to be a lack of will among the leaders of the coup.
And my other question goes to the fact that you and I are both aware, and I know that when you're covering a story like this for hours and hours, you have a lot of things in the back of your mind that sometimes you don't get an opportunity to report. And my only question before we leave you in Moscow and let you get some sleep is there anything now rumbling around in your mind that sticks out, that impresses you?
Well, I think the thing that impresses me most is the way this whole thing has played itself out from the beginning. If you look back, 6:45, Monday morning, the coup was announced. Mikhail Gorbachev was out. Gennady Yanayev, his vice president, is in as acting president. Then the list came out from TASS and was read out on television of the people who were running this coup. The strange thing was that Moscow was deadly silent, with only a few armored vehicles rumbling around, and those not seen until about 8 o'clock, already an hour and 15 minutes after the coup was announced. And the full force of the Soviet army that was brought into place here in Moscow to keep the peace, as the coup leaders have said, wasn't even moving into the city until nearly 10 o'clock. The timing of that has puzzled me all along, and it will continue to puzzle me. I don't know that we'll ever find an answer. And beyond that, the seeming lack of will, or at least the inability of the leaders of this coup to decide upon a concerted action. After all, I think that they have already damaged themselves severely in the face of world public opinion. You would think that if they were going to have a coup, they would have a coup.
Our Moscow Bureau Chief Steve Hurst, working on his 24th hour of being awake, reporting live as dawn comes to this Soviet capital. Thank you, Steve. People in Leningrad also are bracing to defend their city against this coup. As midnight passed, the deputy mayor appealed for citizens to form human barricades like those in Moscow. Tens of thousands of people filled the center of Leningrad Monday as word of the coup spread. Another 200,000 showed up Tuesday. The Leningrad city government is dominated by reformers aligned with Boris Yeltsin. At this hour, reportedly, they are meeting in City Hall to plan a defense. Vows of resistance also are coming from the Baltic republics of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, all struggling to break away from the USSR. Soviet tanks rumbled through Tallinn in Estonia Monday as the Moscow hardliners moved to seize power. Tuesday, Estonia's parliament responded by declaring independence, quote, immediately. Estonia had previously sought a transition to independence, but it now says negotiation is impossible. The Soviet military also staged a show of force in Lithuania Monday. Lithuanian President Vytautas Landsbergis has responded with radio appeals every half hour, urging his citizens to gather at Parliament. But communications with Lithuania are difficult, and it's not clear what is happening there now. Other republics also are trying to show resistance. Leaders of the Ukraine declared the decrees of the hardliners void on their territory. And Moldavian television reported 400,000 people rallying Tuesday in that southern republic. When we come back on World News, we'll get reaction to these events in the Soviet Union. We'll hear from the United States, where President Bush is refusing to recognize the leaders of this Soviet coup. From the Netherlands, where the European community already is mapping out a response to the overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev. And we'll hear from ethnic communities in the United States, where residents are watching the news and hoping for the best. After directing the United States response to the Soviet coup, President Bush left the White House Tuesday to return to his vacation in Maine. Mr. Bush took a quick boat trip in the late afternoon, but admits his time off now will involve less relaxing. While here in Washington, the president swore in Robert Strauss as United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. Mr. Strauss is now en route to Moscow, but he will not present his credentials to coup leaders.
I'm asking him to go over there, get the lay of the land, establish what will be strong leadership. The embassy, we've got a good team in place, but this man is in charge of this important mission, and then to return within the next several days to give me a full personal report on what he sees there.
The president says he will not recognize what he calls the illegal coup. At a news conference Tuesday, Mr. Bush said he had tried to reach deposed Soviet President Gorbachev by telephone several times without success. But the president was able to speak with Russian Republic President Boris Yeltsin.
I told him that we respect you. You've been duly elected here. We pray for you, and we hope that you're successful. And what he wants to see is the restoration of constitutional government. He wants to see the rights of the republics, and he wants to see President Gorbachev restored to power. And he didn't say he's afraid. He's a very courageous man. And he says he's convinced that the people will stand with him, and well, they should.
And just in case you missed the president's news conference when we carried it live, CNN will replay President Bush's news conference in a few hours from now at 1 a.m. Eastern Time. The European community is condemning the hardliners' coup as, quote, clearly unconstitutional. The community's leaders are scheduled to meet in a summit Friday. From the United States, Secretary of State James Baker is heading to Europe to help work out the Western response. CNN's Rick Salinger reports.
Foreign ministers of the 12 European community nations gathered in The Hague and immediately froze nearly $1.5 billion in economic aid to the Soviet Union. It was also decided an emergency European summit will be called for later in the week. France is asking for a meeting between the EC and the ousted Soviet leader. In Moscow, Boris Yeltsin addressed a crowd of supporters outside the Russian parliament. Moments later, he had an urgent phone conversation with British Prime Minister John Major.
He hoped that we would continue to coordinate the activities of the world community against the originators of the coup in Moscow. At that stage in our conversation, President Yeltsin interrupted to say that tanks were moving towards the building from which he was speaking. He said to me that he believed he had not very much time left.
Yeltsin's resistance to the coup is being widely applauded in Europe.
I should congratulate him on the remarkable courage and leadership he has shown when suddenly confronted with an unexpected crisis. I think he's been marvelous. He hasn't hesitated. He has the authority of the people behind him. He was elected.
The turmoil in Moscow has raised the issue whether Western Europe should proceed with planned defense cuts. But Britain's Defense Secretary Tom King says his country's cuts will happen.
Well, we took into account when we made our original proposals and considered them. There's always the risk that obviously that President Gorbachev wouldn't succeed in terms of continuing in office. He faced huge tensions and pressures within the Soviet Union. Our plans were based much more on the massive strategic changes that have taken place in Eastern Europe.
The pictures coming out of the Soviet Union are already having a chilling effect on Western businesses that look to that country as a new, untapped market.
I'm sure that the one thing we are going to see is a downturn in new projects that are coming on as the bankers, who were already extremely nervous over the Soviet Union, now refuse to give any money for investments in the Soviet Union.
If Western business ventures collapse, the Soviet Union stands to lose more than the West. And a cutoff of Western aid to the USSR won't help matters either.
Most of the European economic aid to the Soviet Union was in the pipeline, not yet there. So any cutoff of that aid is more likely to have a symbolic effect rather than any immediate impact that could force the return of Mikhail Gorbachev to power. Rick Salinger, CNN, London.
Reportedly, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein has received a letter from acting Soviet President Gennady Yanayev. The official Iraqi news agency is reporting the contents, saying the Soviet Union will be resuming its international role. Saddam's state-run press is cheering the coup in Moscow. For 20 years, the Soviets sided with Iraq, but during the Persian Gulf War, Moscow joined the coalition, which defeated Iraq.